There is a piece of paper that spent 40 years inside the breast pocket of a jacket belonging to James Maitland Stewart. Not a wallet, not a photograph, not the kind of thing a man keeps because it makes him feel good. A piece of paper that he folded in half on the morning of April 25, 1945, inside a Quonset hut on a military airbase in England, while outside the windows the ground crews were still hosing the blood off the tarmac from the night before. He folded it, put it in his breast pocket, and he kept it there for every day of the 40 years that followed. He kept it in his jacket when he filmed It's a Wonderful Life. He kept it when he married Gloria McLean in 1949, when the photographer asked him to hold still and he reached up briefly to touch the left side of his chest before dropping his hand and smiling for the camera. He kept it in his breast pocket on the night he received his Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Film Institute in 1980, when the audience of 1,500 people gave him a standing ovation and he stood at the podium with his eyes red and his voice unsteady and thanked everyone he could think of, and then stopped himself just before saying the names he actually most wanted to say, the names that were on that piece of paper. The names he had been carrying against his heart for 4 decades and had never spoken aloud in a public place until a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1983 in Studio One at NBC Burbank, when Johnny Carson reached into a manila envelope that had arrived by military courier 3 days earlier and placed a document on the desk between them that made James Stewart go completely still, the way a man goes still when he sees something he has spent 40 years keeping alive in private and has never expected to see in the world outside himself. But before we get into what was on that document, and what Jimmy Stewart pulled from his breast pocket 47 minutes into that taping, and what he said when he finally set it on Carson's desk after carrying it for longer than most of the people watching that program had been alive, I want to take a moment to say something directly. I see messages in the comments every single week from people who have been watching this channel for months and only just realized they never subscribed. If these stories have meant something to you, please check right now. It costs nothing, and it is what keeps these stories coming. Thank you. And now, let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin in 1941, because that is where the 40 years of silence started, and you cannot understand what broke on that stage in 1983 without understanding what was built in those years when the world was burning and James Stewart chose to go toward the fire. In November of 1941, James Maitland Stewart was 33 years old and the most beloved actor in America. It's a Wonderful Life had not yet been filmed, but Mr. Smith Goes to Washington had, and The Philadelphia Story had, and every film he had made in the previous 4 years had confirmed something that audiences understood instinctively and critics struggled to articulate, that this tall, angular man from Indiana, Pennsylvania, with the halting speech and the enormous hands and the absolute inability to project anything other than exactly what he was feeling, had found a way to make the act of performing disappear entirely. You did not watch Jimmy Stewart act, you watched a man live. He was the most natural thing that had ever happened to the camera, and he was, by every external measure, at the beginning of the most successful decade of his career. And then, in November of 1941, James Stewart walked into a military recruitment office in Los Angeles and tried to enlist in the United States Army Air Corps. They turned him down. He was underweight. He failed the physical. He went back to MGM for another round of films. But he was not the same man who had walked into the recruitment office, and everyone who knew him could feel the difference. He was 20 pounds underweight because he had been training in secret for months, taking flying lessons and restricting his eating because the Army had a weight requirement, and he had not been meeting it. He had been working methodically and in complete private to make himself into someone the Army would take. His friend Henry Fonda had already enlisted in the Navy. The country was about to go to war, and James Stewart had decided, without announcing it to anyone, that he was going. He tried again in March of 1942. This time he passed. What followed was not the kind of military service that studios arrange for their actors. There was no publicity assignment, no morale tour, no comfortable desk job in Washington. Jimmy Stewart flew combat missions over Germany. He flew 20 combat missions in B-24 Liberator bombers as a pilot and as a command pilot, meaning he was responsible not just for his own aircraft, but for the formation of aircraft flying with him. He was responsible for the men in those planes. He was responsible for getting them home. Not all of them came home. The specific numbers are not comfortable to read. The 453rd Bomb Group, the unit Stewart commanded as a colonel by the end of the war, suffered significant losses throughout the campaign over occupied Europe. Missions to targets like Ludwigshafen, Gotha, Brunswick, and Oschersleben were not abstract strategic operations. They were hours of sustained terror inside a metal fuselage at altitude, the aircraft surrounded by anti-aircraft fire, the men inside it looking at one another over the noise of 4 engines and trying not to show what they were feeling. The B-24 Liberator was not a forgiving aircraft. It was large and it was heavy, and when it was hit, it did not always go gently. The men who flew it knew this. They flew it anyway, mission after mission, because that was the assignment, and because the men beside them were flying it, and because there was a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with not being afraid and everything to do with choosing to be there regardless of what afraid feels like. Stewart knew all of this from the inside. He was not directing these missions from a command post on the ground. He was in the aircraft. He was the command pilot, which meant that when the formation hit resistance, when the aircraft around him were damaged or destroyed, when men he had eaten breakfast with that morning were no longer in the sky beside him, he was the one responsible for bringing the rest of the formation home. And then he was the one who wrote the mission report. And then he was the one who wrote the letters. Stewart has spoken about this in fragments over the decades, never in full, always in a way that deflected the question before it could land properly. When interviewers asked him about the war, he would say something brief and general, and then change the subject with the fluid efficiency of a man who has been avoiding a specific room in his own house for so long that the avoidance has become automatic. He developed what his biographers would later call a professional cheerfulness about the whole subject, a way of acknowledging it without entering it, a way of standing in the doorway without crossing the threshold. He would say that he was proud to have served. He would say that the men he served with were the best he had ever known. He would not say their names. He would not describe the missions. He would not talk about what it felt like to fly back to the airbase with empty seats behind him and write the letters that nobody wanted to write. There were specific moments. A reporter from a major magazine, interviewing him in 1956 during the promotional run for The Man Who Knew Too Much, asked him directly what combat had felt like, and Stewart paused for so long that the reporter later wrote in his notes that he thought the tape recorder had stopped working. Then Stewart said, "You know, I think I'll pass on that one if you don't mind." And the reporter, who had been told before the interview that this topic was off limits, nodded and moved on. But the pause was 22 seconds long. The reporter wrote it down. He did not include it in the article. At the American Film Institute tribute in 1980, when Cary Grant stood at the podium and said that Jimmy Stewart was the most decent man he had ever known in Hollywood, the camera found Stewart in the audience, and the director chose to hold on his face for a long beat. What was visible on that face, for anyone who was watching carefully, was not what you would expect from a man being praised by one of his oldest friends. It was something more complicated. It was the expression of a man who has been told he is good and is thinking of the specific ways in which he knows himself to be in debt. The camera moved away. The tribute continued. Stewart smiled when the lights came back up and said something modest and warm into his microphone, and the moment passed. But wait, because the story of why he stopped talking about it, and the exact moment when the silence became a decision rather than a habit, is something that nobody knew until he described it on Carson's stage in 1983. And it begins not with a battle or a mission, but with a letter that his father Alex Stewart wrote him before he shipped out to England in November of 1943, which Jimmy Stewart kept in his left breast pocket alongside the piece of paper he would fold and place there a year and a half later. For a period of approximately 18 months, Jimmy Stewart flew combat missions over Germany with his father's letter and his own list both pressed against his heart, and he never told anyone what either of them said. Alex Stewart was a hardware store owner in Indiana, Pennsylvania. He was a veteran of the First World War, a man who had seen what war did to the men who came back from it and to the families of the men who did not. He wrote his son a letter before Jimmy left for England. It was 3 pages long. Jimmy read it on the transport ship crossing the Atlantic, in the bunk below deck, with a flashlight, and when he folded it and put it away, he did not read it again for 20 years. He did not need to. He had memorized it. He had memorized it the way you memorize something that you read at the exact moment when it becomes the most important thing you have ever read, which is to say that he did not choose to memorize it. It simply stayed. The letter said many things. It talked about courage and about fear, and about the difference between the two, about how fear is what reminds you that what you are doing matters, about how a man who is not afraid is not brave but simply unaware of the stakes. It talked about the hardware store, and about the town, and about the neighbors who were sending their own sons and daughters to serve, and who were proud of all of them, including Jimmy. But the part that stayed, the part that would sit inside Jimmy Stewart's chest alongside the mission debrief sheet for 4 decades, was one paragraph near the end, written in his father's large and deliberate handwriting. Alex Stewart wrote, "Jimmy, I don't know what you're going to see over there, or what you're going to carry back, but I know this much. The things that break a man are not the things that happened to him. They are the things that happened to the people standing next to him that he could not stop. So when you can't stop it, when you do everything right and it still goes wrong, you will want to find a reason it was your fault. Don't. The people next to you chose to be there the same as you chose to be there. What you owe them is not guilt. What you owe them is memory. Remember them the way they were at their best, and carry that. That's the weight that's worth carrying." Jimmy Stewart read that paragraph on the transport ship in 1943, and for 40 years he did exactly what his father told him to do. He remembered them. He carried it, and because he carried it privately, because the names on that mission debrief sheet were his to keep and not to display, the silence became the form the memory took. He did not talk about the war because talking about it would have made it a story, and it was not a story. It was a list of names. It was a list of men, and lists of men are not stories. They are debts. And here is the part that nobody knew until the spring of 1983. When Johnny Carson received a manila envelope from the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency in Montgomery, Alabama. The envelope contained a single document, 3 pages, single-spaced, typed on Army Air Force's letterhead. It was a mission summary from the 453rd Bomb Group, Station 144, Old Buckenham, England. The date on the document was January 7, 1944. The mission, Ludwigshafen, Germany. The command pilot listed, Major James M. Stewart, and at the bottom of the 3rd page, under the heading Personnel Losses, were 11 names. Johnny Carson had requested that document 6 weeks before the taping. He had made the request through a military records researcher, after learning that Stewart had flown the Ludwigshafen mission, which had been one of the most costly single-day losses for the 453rd. He had the document placed in the envelope and put in his desk drawer, and he had not shown it to Stewart during any of their pre-show preparation. He had not told his producer. He had not told Ed McMahon. He had placed it there as the thing he would produce if the conversation reached the right moment. And he had waited. I need to pause here and tell you something about how the taping began, because the beginning of that evening is important for understanding what the ending meant. Stewart arrived at the studio at 4 in the afternoon, 90 minutes before the scheduled taping. He was 74 years old, which in 1983 meant he looked exactly as old as he was, which is to say he looked like a man who had earned every year. He was still tall, still angular, still carrying those enormous hands that had always made him look slightly awkward in formal clothes. His hair was steel gray and neatly combed. He wore a dark charcoal wool suit with a white dress shirt and a muted olive green tie. He moved carefully, the careful movement of a tall man in his mid-70s who has learned to be deliberate about where he puts his feet. The makeup artist noted that he was very quiet. The stage manager noted that he did not touch the coffee that was brought to him. Fred de Cordova noted that when Stewart sat in the green room waiting for the taping to begin, he sat with his right hand resting over the left side of his chest, over the breast pocket of his jacket, in the unconscious gesture of a man checking that something is still where he left it. Now, I want to talk to you for a second before we get into the taping itself. This channel runs on community support alone. No sponsors, no brand deals. If you want to be part of keeping these stories alive, please consider joining the membership. Become one of the people keeping these forgotten stories alive. Tap join below and see what's waiting inside. And now, back to Studio One in Burbank, to a Tuesday evening in the spring of 1983, to the first 47 minutes of a Tonight Show taping that began exactly as everyone expected it to, and ended in a way that nobody who was there has ever been able to describe without their voice changing. The taping began at 5:30. Johnny's monologue was about politics and about the weather and about a story involving a supermarket in New Jersey. The audience laughed in the right places. Ed McMahon chuckled from his position to the left of the desk. Everything proceeded with the mechanical smoothness of a program that had been running for 21 years and knew exactly what it was doing. At 6:12, Ed McMahon's introduction was simple and warm in the way that only a few introductions that season were allowed to be simple and warm, reserved for the people who did not need a build-up because their name was already the whole story. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. James Stewart. The audience response was something that the camera operators said afterward they had not heard in years. Not the explosive, immediate excitement that greeted comedians or musicians, something older and slower. The way you applaud someone who has been part of your life for so long that the applause is also gratitude. People stood, not because they were excited, but because they felt they owed it. Stewart walked through the curtain with his careful, deliberate step, his large hands visible at his sides, and he looked slightly bewildered by the response in the particular way that he had always looked slightly bewildered by the response, as though he had never quite understood why so many people felt so much for him and had given up trying to figure it out. He shook Carson's hand. He sat down. He looked at the audience with the expression that audiences had always recognized as the truest thing about him, which was simply that he saw them, not the room, not the cameras, not the ratings, the people. For the first 30 minutes of the taping, the conversation was exactly what the audience expected, which was to say it was warm and funny, and full of the particular self-deprecating humor that Stewart had always used as a way of being honest, without being heavy. He talked about westerns, and about the horse he had ridden in so many of them. He talked about his friendship with Henry Fonda, and about the time the two of them had built a model airplane in Fonda's apartment so badly that it had nearly caught fire. He talked about being old in a business that worshipped youth, and about finding, somewhat to his surprise, that he did not mind it. The audience laughed. Carson laughed. Stewart's large hands rested on his knees, and he leaned forward occasionally, with the slight hunch of a tall man who has spent a lifetime compensating for the fact that most furniture is made for people 6 inches shorter. And then, at the 31st minute of the taping, Carson said, "Jimmy, I want to ask you about the war." Stewart's expression did not change visibly, but his hands moved. Both of them came together in his lap, and the fingers interlaced in the particular grip of a man who is holding himself in place. "Johnny," he said, and his voice had the slight hesitation that everyone who had ever listened to him speak recognized as the authentic texture of his thought rather than a performance of it. "Johnny, I appreciate you asking, but that's not something I talk about. You know that." "I know," Carson said, "and I'm not going to push you, but I have something I want to show you, and I want you to look at it before you decide." Stewart looked at him. There was a long pause. In the control room, Fred de Cordova was completely still. The camera operators held their positions. 300 people in the audience sat with the particular quality of attention that descends on a room when something is about to happen that nobody can predict. Carson reached into his desk drawer. He brought out the manila envelope. He opened it carefully and removed the 3-page document. He did not hand it to Stewart. He placed it on the desk between them, face up. And he said, "This is a mission summary from the 453rd Bomb Group. January 7th, 1944. Ludwigshafen." Stewart did not move for approximately 7 seconds. He looked at the document. He looked at it the way you look at something that you have been carrying inside you for 40 years and have never expected to see rendered in typed official language on government stationery. The expression on his face was not one that the camera operators, the audience, or anyone watching at home had ever seen on Jimmy Stewart's face before. It was not sadness. It was not shock. It was something more specific than either of those things. The expression of a man who has been keeping a private accounting for 4 decades and has just been shown that the accounting has been seen. His right hand moved to the left side of his chest. It rested there over the breast pocket. It stayed there. "Do you want me to read the names?" Carson asked very quietly, and Jimmy Stewart said, just as quietly, "No, I know the names." The studio was completely silent. 300 people were not moving, not coughing, not shifting in their seats. The orchestra had stopped. Ed McMahon had not moved since the moment the document came out of the envelope. "You know all of them," Carson said. Stewart nodded. He did not look away from the document. "All 11, he said. "I have known all 11 for 40 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that nobody in that studio was prepared for. He said, "I knew them before it happened too." That is the thing that people do not understand about this. They were not strangers who died in my care. They were men I had eaten breakfast with, men I had played cards with, men who had shown me photographs of their families. Raymond Kessler had a daughter named Catherine, who was 3 years old in January of 1944, and he showed me her photograph 3 days before the mission. Harold Vance had just gotten a letter from his mother in Oklahoma, saying that she had planted a victory garden in the backyard, and that the tomatoes were coming in better than expected, and he read it to me while we were waiting for the weather briefing. Arthur Pilkington had been engaged for 8 months, and he was calculating, he told me this himself, he was calculating how many more missions he had to fly before he had enough time in to put in for leave so he could go home and get married. Stewart stopped. His jaw was tight. His hand was still pressed against his breast pocket. Those are not casualties. Those are not statistics. Those are men. And every time someone asked me about the war, and I smiled and said something about being proud to serve and changed the subject, I told myself I was protecting them, that their stories were not mine to tell, that I had no right to use their deaths as material for a television interview or a magazine article or an awards speech. And I still believe that. I still believe that. But he stopped again. The pause lasted long enough that Carson did not fill it, because Carson had learned, over 21 years of sitting across from people at this desk, that the pauses were often the most important part of what someone was trying to say. "But I have been keeping this," Stewart said, and his right hand moved from his breast pocket to the lapel of his jacket, and he reached inside and withdrew a piece of paper. It was small and folded, worn at the fold lines to a softness that comes from decades of being opened and opened again. He held it for a moment, without unfolding it. He looked at it the way you look at something that has been part of your body for so long that seeing it outside yourself is slightly disorienting. "I wrote these names down the morning after the mission," he said, "on a debrief sheet. I wrote all 11 names, and I folded it up, and I put it in my pocket, and I have carried it since April of 1945. He paused. "I have had it cleaned with my suits. I have transferred it from jacket to jacket. I have reached for it at night sometimes, in the dark, just to feel that it was still there." He placed the paper on Carson's desk beside the official document. He did not unfold it. "For 40 years I told myself that keeping quiet was the right way to honor them, that the silence was the tribute, that making it public would make it about me, and I still think that is mostly true. But I think there is also a thing that happens when you carry something alone for long enough. You start to forget that the weight is shared. You start to feel like you are the only one who remembers, and that is not honoring them. That is just being lonely. Wait, do not miss what just happened in that room. Because the audience in that studio had come to see Jimmy Stewart be charming and funny and tell stories about horses and old Hollywood, and what they were watching instead was a 74-year-old man set down something he had been carrying since 1945 and describe, for the first time in public, what it had weighed. And the reason it matters is not just that it was moving, though it was, and not just that it was honest, though it was, but that what Jimmy Stewart was describing was something that an enormous number of the people in that room recognized from their own lives: the private keeping, the weight that never goes away because it was never meant to be carried alone. Carson said, very quietly, "Jimmy, can I ask what your father wrote you?" Stewart looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He told me that what I would owe the men next to me was not guilt. He said what I owed them was memory. He said to carry that. To carry the weight that was worth carrying." He paused. "I have been doing that. I have been doing that for 40 years. But I think I got confused somewhere along the way. I think I started carrying it the way you carry a burden, instead of the way you carry a privilege. I think I started holding on to the weight of it and forgetting that the weight is what makes it real. You do not resent a weight that is precious to you. You are grateful for it." Carson said nothing. He waited, and Stewart said, "Raymond Kessler, Harold Vance, Arthur Pilkington, George Abernathy, William Sousa, Thomas Nally, Frank Dempsey, Carl Ruiz, Patrick Hoyle, Sidney Werner, John Crane." He said every name clearly and at a measured pace. The pace of a man who has said these names in private for 40 years and is saying them in public for the first time, making sure each one is heard. After each name he paused briefly. After the 11th name, he paused longer. The studio was completely still. After a moment, he said, "They were 22 years old. 23. 25. Arthur Pilkington was 26, and he never got to go home and get married. And I have been alive for 40 more years since January of 1944, and I have been in motion pictures, and received awards, and met presidents, and done all the things that a man does when the world treats him well and he is lucky enough to live long. And every single day of those 40 years I have known that the reason I was able to do those things is that on January 7th, 1944, 11 men flew a mission with me and did not come home from it. And I came home, and I have never once been able to explain why." If you are still watching at this point in the story, please take a second and hit the like button. It is the simplest thing you can do, and it genuinely helps keep this channel going. And now, because what happened in the final minutes of that taping is the part that the people who were there remember most clearly, let us finish it properly. Carson waited a long time before speaking. When he did, his voice was different from his usual register, quieter and more careful. The voice he used on the rare occasions when he stopped being a host and became simply a person sitting across from another person who had just said something true. He said, "Jimmy, do you think they would have wanted you to talk about them?" Stewart looked at him. He thought about it for a long moment, the visible thinking of a man who has spent his life being honest and is not going to stop now. "I think," Stewart said slowly, "I think Arthur Pilkington would have wanted me to tell people he was going to get married. I think Harold Vance would have wanted me to mention his mother's tomatoes. I think Raymond Kessler would have wanted me to say that his daughter Catherine, wherever she is now, that she was 3 years old, and that her father had her photograph in his pocket, and that she was what he was thinking about." He paused. "I think they would have wanted to be people, not casualties, not statistics, not names at the bottom of a government document. People, and I have been protecting their personhood for 40 years by keeping them private, and I think I may have done the opposite of what I intended. I think I may have kept them from being people by refusing to let them be known." Carson reached across the desk and picked up the folded piece of paper, the one Stewart had carried for 40 years. He held it out toward Stewart. He said, "Do you want this back?" Stewart looked at it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that no one in that studio expected, and that no one who was there has been able to quote without stopping, because it is the kind of sentence that does not survive being quoted out of the moment in which it was said. He said, "I think I have been carrying it long enough. I think it is time to let them be somewhere other than just with me." He did not take the paper back. He looked at Carson and he said, "You keep it. You read their names again sometime. On air, off air, it doesn't matter. Just say them somewhere where somebody can hear them." And then Jimmy Stewart, who had not cried in a public place since the premiere of It's a Wonderful Life in 1946, and who had spent 40 years maintaining, in every interview and every public appearance, the composed and gentle demeanor of a man who has his emotions firmly in hand, looked at the 300 people in that studio and at the cameras beyond them and allowed, for the first time in those 40 years, the full weight of what he had been carrying to be visible on his face. He did not apologize for it. He did not try to deflect it with humor or with grace. He simply let it be there, the way it had been there, behind everything, for 4 decades, and he let the people watching see it. The Tonight Show taping ran 43 minutes over its scheduled length. NBC received more calls in the hour following the broadcast than it had received for any single Tonight Show taping in 11 years. The calls were not from people who wanted to talk about Jimmy Stewart, the actor. They were from veterans, from the families of veterans, from people who had lost someone in a war and recognized, in what they had watched, something about the particular texture of a grief that is kept private for so long that it becomes almost indistinguishable from the person carrying it. The Tonight Show taping from that evening was rebroadcast twice in the following 18 months, which was unusual for a program that almost never repeated content. The first rebroadcast came 6 weeks after the original taping, after the network received more mail about that single episode than about any other taping in the previous decade. The second came the following Veterans Day, in November of 1983, when NBC ran it as a standalone special, with a brief introduction by a news anchor who noted that the calls and letters had not stopped coming, and that the network felt a responsibility to the people who had not been able to see it the first time. Veterans organizations wrote to The Tonight Show. Military historians wrote to The Tonight Show. A professor at a university in Ohio who taught a course on the psychological aftermath of combat wrote to say that what Stewart had described, the private keeping, the confusion between guilt and tribute, the silence as a form of honor that becomes a form of isolation, was something that most veterans experienced and almost none articulated, and that she was going to show the taping to her students for the rest of her career. Carson wrote back to every letter personally. It took him 4 months. 3 days after the taping, the 11 families of the men on that mission list received individual letters from Jimmy Stewart. Each letter was handwritten. Each letter contained specific memories of the man by name. Each letter ended with the same sentence: "Your father, your son, your brother, your husband was known to me and was not forgotten by me, and I want you to know that." Most of the families wrote back. James Stewart died on July 2, 1997. He was 89 years old. Among the contents of his personal effects, his family found, in the top left drawer of his desk, a small collection of letters bundled together with a rubber band. They were the letters from the 11 families. Below them, folded and worn, was the original piece of paper. He had asked Carson to keep it, and Carson had kept it for the duration of his time at The Tonight Show, and at some point in the years after Carson's retirement, it had found its way back. It was still folded in the same way, along the same lines, soft from 40 years of being carried, and then 12 more of being kept in a drawer by a man who had agreed to hold it until Stewart was ready. He had always been ready. It just took him 40 years and a conversation with Johnny Carson to understand that being ready did not mean being without grief. It meant being willing to let other people into the grief with you. It meant understanding that the weight shared is not the weight diminished. It is the weight honored. Before you close this video, I want to ask you to think about something. There is probably something you have been carrying alone, something that happened a long time ago that you have been keeping private out of a sense that the privacy is a form of respect for the people involved. It might be. Jimmy Stewart was right about that. But it might also be that the silence has become a habit that you have confused for a tribute. It is worth asking the difference. It is worth asking whether the people you are carrying would want you to set them down long enough to let someone else help you hold them. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who has been carrying something quietly for a long time. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because these stories reach people everywhere, and I want to know where the truth is landing.